Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. So before we move on to megaloblastic or pernicious anemia, we need to discuss about vitamin B12 absorption. So vitamin B12 is actually a water-soluble vitamin, a constituent of vitamin B complex, and it is also known as cobalamin. So as the name indicates, vitamin B12 contains an essential element known as cobalt. The particular thing about the micronutrients, such as vitamins and minerals, is that the human bodies cannot produce these micronutrients. So the humans totally rely on the dietary sources, and in this particular context, the richest sources of vitamin B12 include meat, eggs, fish, and dairy products. The minor sources of vitamin B12 include certain fruits such as apples, blueberries, and bananas. And trace amount is also present in certain vegetables such as potato, beetroot, and mushroom. Vitamin B12 is essentially required by the body for cell division since it has a major role in the DNA synthesis. The daily requirement of vitamin B12 is around 2 to 3 micrograms, which is sufficiently met by the dietary sources. And there is enough reserve of vitamin B12 that the deficiency of vitamin B12 takes years to develop. So we will cut to the chase and discuss about vitamin B12 absorption. And to make the subject more easy, we will divide vitamin B12 absorption into 4 phases. So the vitamin B12 present in the diet is bound to a specific protein known as a binding protein. And this here is a vitamin B12 and binding protein complex. This vitamin B12 and binding protein complex is split by the pepsin secreted by the stomach. The pepsin splits vitamin B12 and binding protein into respective vitamin B12 and the binding protein. Up till this point, the first phase of B12 absorption is complete. In the first phase, binding protein and B12 complexes are broken down into individual vitamin B12 and binding protein. Next is the second phase, in which the isolated vitamin B12 binds to a specific protein which is secreted by the salivary glands, and this protein is known as heptocorin. So this heptocorin binds the vitamin B12 and hence forms a heptocorin B12 complex. This combination occurs in the stomach, and heptocorin B12 complex is transported to the intestine, preserving it from the digestion by the gastric and intestinal enzymes. In the duodenum, this heptocorin B12 complex is split by the proteases into individual vitamin B12 and heptocorin. This is the second phase of the vitamin B12 absorption. Coming on towards the third phase, there are parietal cells present in the gastric mucosa which secrete a specific binding protein known as intrinsic factor. The intrinsic factor is secreted in the stomach, but it binds to the vitamin B12 in duodenum. As you can see, this here is an intrinsic factor, and this is vitamin B12, and here it is forming intrinsic factor vitamin B12 complex. This complex is then transported to ileum, where the enterocytes lining the ileum possess a specific receptor known as intrinsic factor receptor, or also known as cubilin. This here is a receptor, and this is the intrinsic factor which is bound to the intrinsic factor receptor or cubilin. This complex is endocytosed by the enterocytes, and again the intrinsic factor B12 complex is broken down into individual vitamin B12 and unbound intrinsic factor. Up till this point, the third phase of B12 absorption has been completed. Next comes the fourth phase or the final phase of vitamin B12 absorption. In this phase, the individual vitamin B12 binds to a specific transporting protein known as transcobalamin 2, and B12 transcobalamin 2 complex transports the absorbed vitamin B12 through the portal vein to the liver, from where it is further delivered to sites of rapid cell division such as bone marrow and enterocytes. So with this, the absorption of vitamin B12 or cobalamin is complete. So a quick recap, vitamin B12 is derived from only food. Within the food, it is bound to a specific protein known as the binding protein, and B12 binding protein complex is broken down by the pepsin into individual vitamin B12 and the binding protein. The salivary glands secrete a protein known as heptocorin, which binds the vitamin B12 and carries it to the duodenum. In the duodenum, by specific proteases, the B12 heptocorin complex is split into vitamin B12 and heptocorin. The intrinsic factor is secreted by the parietal cells of the stomach. The intrinsic factor binds to vitamin B12, which then transports it to the ileum. The intrinsic factor recognizes a specific receptor present on the enterocytes, which is known as intrinsic factor receptor, or also known as tubulin. The intrinsic factor B12 complex binds to this receptor, and this binding results in the endocytosis of intrinsic factor B12 complex. And inside the enterocytes, the B12 intrinsic factor complex is again broken down into individual vitamin B12 and intrinsic factor. The isolated B12 now combines with the specific transporter known as transcobalamin 2. This transcobalamin 2 transports the absorbed vitamin B12 to liver, from where it is disseminated throughout the body, and more particularly in those areas where the rate of cell division is relatively higher. And these areas particularly include the bone marrow. So this brings us to the end of discussion about vitamin B12 absorption. If you have any questions, do let us know in the comment section. Thank you.